Hey everyone, this is GC Kinsey, and today I'm going to be talking about trans identity versus transition goals. Every trans person has their own unique journey toward figuring out what's going on with their gender, but most of us have a few moments in common. The first one is this moment of, oh my gosh, I think I might not be cis. What is the deal? What is going on? Who am I? And the second one, which usually happens after some self-reflection, is this moment of, okay, now I know I'm not cis, what now? And those two realizations, the who am I and the what now, are not exactly cut and dried. They're not simple questions, and they don't have simple answers. It's really easy to get them tangled up with each other. And that can sometimes get us bogged down into this limbo where we don't have any idea what to do about any of this gender stuff. I know because I have been that person. I spent a long time in my sort of questioning and self-discovery phase, and I spent just as long, if not longer, trying to figure out what all of that meant for my future. And what finally gave me some clarity was framing those questions, the who am I and the what now, as two separate issues, which I think of as trans identity and transition goals. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, shouldn't those questions be tackled together? Aren't they deeply intertwined? Why would you take them on as kind of two separate issues? So I want to talk about why I do that, why I treat them as separate things. And to do that, I want to start by going on a little journey back in time. When I went to South Carolina Comic-Con in 2016, I cosplayed as Bucky Barnes and I did his plainclothes look from Civil War, which meant I needed a beard. So I did all the research, I figured out how to put one on using mascara. There is a tutorial on my channel that explains how to do that, by the way. So I put the beard on, I put the costume on, and I went to the con. And I was overwhelmed by the responses I got to that beard and how I felt about those responses. There were people who asked me, how long did it take you to grow that? Guys complimenting me on how my beard looked better than theirs. People who actually, came up to me thinking that I was a cis guy at first until they heard my voice. I couldn't stop taking selfies. I could not stop looking at myself in the mirror. At the end of the day, once I got back from the con, I didn't want to take it off. And then I kept thinking, what is the deal with this feeling? In hindsight, it is pretty obvious that that was the moment that my egg cracked. But the shell didn't fully break open for another year. At the time, I wasn't asking myself questions like, am I trans? Or what is the deal with my gender? I was just wearing that beard to cons and charity events, getting that same kind of response, enjoying that same kind of response, and having those feelings come back again and again. And finally, after that happened enough, it occurred to me to ask myself, wait a minute, this isn't something that cis people actually enjoy, is it? What does that mean for me? So by the time Animazement 2017 rolled around, a little over a year later, I had this kind of epiphany. During that con, I started actively paying attention to how people were responding based on the different ways that I was presenting my gender. And I actually did a pretty good sweep across the board. I had one cosplay that was sort of more traditionally feminine. I had a drag queen look. I had a very androgynous look. All of these looks, by the way, had a really queer vibe overall. And I cataloged the way that people responded to those different presentations. And I thought about that in comparison to how people responded to me in the sort of more masculine presentation as Bucky Barnes with the beard. And it kind of got me to this point by the end of that con of thinking, oh wow, I might be non-binary. Spoiler alert, I totally was right. I am indeed non-binary. But at that time, I had no idea how to even begin to start working through these feelings and these realizations I was having. So I went on the internet, as one does, to see if anybody else had experienced anything like this. And I found a flood of information, much of which was very helpful. By the way, this is why it is so important that trans people share their stories and their narratives if they can. Obviously, nobody is obligated to do that, but if you are able and you are willing and you are brave enough to share that aspect of yourself with the world, it really does help those of us who are just trying to figure it out. So thank you. The other thing I did was I told my friends that I was questioning my gender. Why didn't I just wait until I knew exactly what my gender was and then come out? Well, a couple of things. One is that a lot of my friends are queer in some way, and some of them are trans or non-binary. So I figured if we talked about this and if I was open, that they might be able to provide some perspective based on what they'd been going through. And if some of them were still questioning themselves, then maybe I could provide some perspective to them and we could all just sort of work through this question together. The other reason I told them is because when I questioned my orientation, I did that entirely on my own. I was scared to tell any of my friends, and it was a very difficult and quite honestly isolating experience. And I did not want to go through that again when it came to my gender. So I felt that it was best to just lay it all out there and talk about it. And it actually worked. By the end of 2018, I was confident enough in understanding who I was to officially, formally, by way of an Instagram post, come out as non-binary, specifically gender fluid. By the way, this only took about half the time that it did to question my orientation, so definitely made the right call there by telling my friends. And coming out kicked off a whole new kind of self-discovery around things like gender dysphoria and gender euphoria and how I deal with and experience both of those things. The relationship between gender and other areas of my life. What terms or labels describe different aspects of who I am? For example, this brought up the question, am I trans? And non-binary people are not assigned non-binary at birth, so technically we're all trans by default, but of course some non-binary people identify with that label trans and some don't. Through that process of self-discovery, I realized that I very much do. And I use the words non-binary, trans, gender fluid, oscillating on a spectrum between genderqueer and transmasculine as different ways to describe myself. I also really like the term genderful, as in full of gender. And all of this falls under the category of trans identity. This is the answer to that question, who am I? This is my internal sense of my gender. But what about that other question, the what now? That falls under the category of transition goals, and that's what I want to talk about next. Because even though there's a relationship between the who am I and the what now, at the end of the day, they really are two very different questions. So now let's go on another journey, the path toward answering that question of what now? This all started right around, during and after the time that I came out, at the end of 2018. So for 2019, I made 2 New Year's resolutions. Resolution number 1, I would express my gender however I wanted to, not just in cosplay, but in my day-to-day life. Cosplay was a great tool to help figure out who I was and to help test the waters of gender expression in a safe environment. But it was starting to feel a lot like training wheels at that point, and I was ready to take them off. I didn't need to be dressed up as Bucky Barnes to wear a beard in public and feel comfortable doing it. I could just do that as myself. Resolution number 2, I would be more proactive about being asked to be called he, him when I was really feeling those pronouns. Spoiler alert, he, him would eventually become the pronouns that definitely felt the best, but at the time I didn't know that. I was still testing the waters, so I wasn't using them full time. These resolutions were the beginning of my social transition, and it worked out pretty well. It gave me a lot of practical, real-world insight into how gender dysphoria and euphoria worked for me, and what kinds of things that I could be thinking about doing to alleviate that dysphoria and increase euphoria going forward. So I was really thinking deeply about that question of what now and starting to take those steps. And I was thinking about them not just in terms of the social aspect of transitioning, but also in terms of any medical transition that I might want to undergo. And at the end of 2019, I wrote a follow-up Instagram post to my coming out post that had a lot of observations and things I'd learned during the course of that year. Then 2020 rolled around and, well, I think we all know what happened. One thing I'd gotten kind of hung up on in 2019 when it came to the medical aspect of transition was what exactly would be right for me and what would I want to do. There were a few different things that did sound quite appealing. One was going on a low dose of testosterone, maybe for a few years, and getting to the point of physical changes that I wanted to see, then coming back off. Another one was related to fitness and changes in my body, and especially, taking advantage of that time on testosterone to really work on building muscle. and another one is getting a hysterectomy. But hormones and surgeries are major life decisions with permanent effects, so of course this was not something I wanted to take lightly. There are pros and cons to any sort of medical transition you might undergo, so it's important to do as much research as you can and know what you might be getting into. And of course, also, we don't live in a perfect utopian society where transphobia doesn't exist, so there are social and economic factors to consider, pros and cons there as well. So I really spent a lot of time kind of weighing all of the different benefits that could come out of medical transition, all of the different risks, and kind of thinking about whether it would be worth it. So I waffled back and forth on this a lot prior to 2020, thinking about it, making the pros and cons list, doing the research, wondering, is this right for me? Is it not? But there's nothing quite like a major historical event that has ramifications all across the world, such as a pandemic, to really put things in perspective and make them crystal clear. And that was one of the things that made me realize I wasn't making any progress on these transition decisions because I was getting too hung up in the idea of my trans identity. I wasn't making any progress on my transition goals. Let me explain what I mean by that. Most of my gender dysphoria is social. So it's tied to the way my gender is perceived during social situations and the way that people interact with me and treat me based on that perception. And in 99.9% of situations with new people I'm meeting for the first time, that perception is unfortunately incorrect. Now, I do experience some body dysphoria in addition to the social dysphoria. A lot of that I have alleviated by losing weight and keeping up with fitness, but the social dysphoria is the real kicker. It's the really big source of stress in my life. And that was what got me so hung up when it came to my transition goals, because there was this question in the back of my mind always about who are you really transitioning for, yourself or all these other people out there? And at the end of the day, you can't control how people are going to perceive you, so doesn't that mean your transition goals should have nothing to do with those other people and be solely based on your internal sense of gender identity? And it was those kind of thoughts that always kept me from reaching a conclusion about what kind of medical transition might be right for me. But the pandemic offered a new perspective because it completely changed the social landscape as we all knew it. I went from in-person to almost exclusively online for every social interaction you could think of, from just shopping to hanging out with my friends. And that meant there were no more of these awkward situations where I would have to hear a well-meaning stranger say something to me like, "Excuse me, ma'am," or "ladies first," that would leave me dying inside for the rest of the day. This hypothetical question I'd been caught up in, would I still need to transition if I no longer had to deal with social dysphoria, suddenly had a very real answer. And that answer was a clear and resounding yes. The pandemic proved that the absence of social dysphoria on its own wasn't really enough for me. It wouldn't help alleviate all of the things that medical transition would, such as helping to deal with my body dysphoria, helping to deal with the dysphoria that I feel about my speaking voice, or increasing gender euphoria. And the pandemic made me realize, ironically enough, how important social interaction actually is. The world cannot function like this forever. It is miserable. I say this as someone who is very much an introvert and who does get extreme social dysphoria. I still miss the world the way it was when people could gather in large groups and have those kinds of social interactions that we used to have. And that lack of social interaction is its own form of stress that can be just as detrimental as dysphoria in other ways. So I knew I would have to prepare for the day when that social interaction eventually comes back, and to know how I'm going to offset the inevitable gender dysphoria that I'm going to feel when it does. And that made me realize it's okay if your transition goals are heavily tied to the social aspect of being trans. It doesn't have to be all about your internal trans identity. So that got me to start framing my transition goals in a whole new way. I started approaching the question of what now as an entirely separate issue from the question of who am I? Instead of thinking along the lines of, how would a non-binary gender fluid person transition? I started asking myself much more specific and concrete questions, like, how do I want my body to look? How do I want my voice to sound? How do I want people to perceive me and interact with me? If and when people misgender me in the future, how do I want my own physical state to be so that I can back up my assertions of the gender that I actually am? And what steps can I take, medically or otherwise, to get to that point? Thinking about my transition goals as their own thing finally got me unstuck, and it clarified what was right for me and what would make me happy. So if you're questioning your gender and you keep getting hung up, you feel like you're drowning in these questions of who am I and what now, pull them apart. Tackle them separately. Try taking on those questions one at a time as two separate issues and see if that helps. At the end of the day, you might find that those questions are very tied together for you and that the answers are interwoven, and that's absolutely fine. But if they're getting you so bogged down that you don't know what to do, then separating trans identity from transition goals might be just the thing you need to finally move forward. And remember, there are no right or wrong answers to the questions of who am I or what now. There's only what's right for you. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something from it, found it helpful. I'd love to hear what you thought, so if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop those below. And if you'd like to see more of these kind of vlog style videos about my experiences as a queer person, please let me know because I would absolutely love to make more of them. My other videos on this channel include cosplay music videos and makeup demos and tutorials, so feel free to check those out as well, and make sure you like and subscribe so that you don't miss anything new. You can also find me on other social media. I am GC Kinsey across all platforms, and I'm linking in the description below to the 2 Instagram posts that I mentioned in this video. So thank you for watching, happy Trans Day of Visibility, and I will see you on the next one.